everyone. My name is Lynn Marie Morski, and I am president of the Psychedelic Medicine Association, host of the Plant Medicine Podcast, and founder of plantmedicine.org. Thanks so much for joining me in a little chat about bridging the gap, incorporating psychedelic therapies into the mainstream medical model. Now, there's been a lot of due focus on getting psychedelics as FDA-approved medicines, and now that approval seems within reach, it's important that we focus on some of the next steps, which is how to get these medicines to the patients who need them and how to best ensure those patients' safety. Now, finding solutions to this is the mission of the Psychedelic Medicine Association. We want to educate those on the front lines of healthcare so as to create the best outcomes for our patients and work toward the solutions that enable equitable access to these medicines. So just a 5-second bio about my background. I am trained as a family medicine physician, and I worked at the VA for 9 years in the compensation and pension department. And I saw that the majority of my colleagues weren't even aware that psychedelic science that research was going on in this area, or that some therapies like ketamine were already available. And so I noticed that there was a need. And so what we're going to talk about today, for those who may not be in the medical industry, is I'm going to talk a little bit about how some current scenarios look as far as physicians and their education in this area, and where we need to go to be able to get these medicines to patients. So for some context, I'm going to give 4 examples of scenarios that could happen right now. We have ketamine that is widely available and legal right now, and the following scenarios may be happening. So the first scenario is a patient, and we'll take this patient, let's say they have severe depression, something that we know ketamine is good at addressing. And if that patient says to his or her primary care doctor, and this could be a physician, this could be a PA, nurse practitioner, or their therapist. So I'll say doctor a lot of times, but I mean anybody who they first go to, because in most medical systems, the primary care doctor is the first person that a patient sees. So before they get to go to a psychiatrist, they generally have to go see their primary care doctor, and they may get referrals to other people. But often that family doctor or that internal medicine doctor is like the first point of contact. Sometimes maybe a counselor as well, if you go straight to a therapist, say, that you just find in the community. So if a patient goes and they say, I have severe depression, and the patient doesn't know about psychedelics, and the physician doesn't know about psychedelics, then that patient, who may have already tried and failed different medications or other types of therapy, they may not get any kind of psychedelic help. So for example, ketamine that's available now, because nobody in that encounter knew about psychedelic medicines. The second example is where that same patient goes in, says, I have really severe depression, and I've tried a number of things. I've tried medication, I've tried therapy, none of those have worked. I would like to try ketamine. What do you think? And that physician may remember ketamine as from my own training back in the day. All we used it for was anesthetizing kids in the emergency room. And so they may think, you want ketamine for depression? That's not something I've heard of. And that you must have just misunderstood the science, because, you know, we go through a lot of training. So it's kind of hard to think, oh, there's something we completely missed about this medicine that we definitely have used before. So in that scenario, the physician, who is very often just working on the side of caution, because if they've never heard of a thing, it's hard to recommend it and feel safe about that recommendation. So they may say, oh, I don't know about that. I don't know that that's a great option. And so the patient still doesn't get the ketamine they need. Now, the third scenario is where the patient comes in, says they have severe depression, and the physician says, oh, ketamine is an option for you. They know about psychedelic science. But then they look it up, and the ketamine treatments are thousands of dollars, and the patient can't afford that. So at the end of the day, even though the physician knew about it and the patient was down with it, the patient still can't get the medicine they need. Now, just one final scenario here. Let's move on from ketamine, and let's talk about, say, something like ibogaine. Imagine you've got a patient who goes into their primary care doctor and says, I'm considering doing ibogaine. I'm leaving the country. I'm going somewhere where it's legal, and I've checked out the place that's safe, and they recommended I come here to you to get approval so that I can be medically cleared for this ibogaine treatment. Well, the doctor may say, okay, I've heard of ibogaine. This is all right. But if the doctor doesn't know that ibogaine is contraindicated in somebody with certain heart arrhythmias, and if that patient has those heart arrhythmias, they may be getting the psychedelic medicine that they desire and that they may need, but they're not getting it safely. And so those are 4 scenarios that all of which could be taking place right now. Ketamine is legal. People could currently be going to do ibogaine in different countries. And these highlight a lot of the gaps that need to be addressed before we can get these to be equitably accessible by all. So I'm going to break this down a little bit, challenge by challenge. We're going to start with the challenges on the clinician side. Challenge number one is that this is not covered in schools, okay? The whole area of psychedelic science being just restarted, think about anybody who has done medical school between like the 70s and the 2000 teens. We were taught nothing about psychedelic science. We weren't even taught about endocannabinoids or cannabis as a medicine. And so it's something that doctors may not know that they don't know about. It's not that we were told psychedelic science exists, we're not teaching you about it. It just wasn't mentioned at all. And so there are a few ways that clinicians get our information. One is medical school or counseling school or nursing school. Another is continuing education courses. So every few years we have to re-credential and we have to take some continuing medical education courses. And those are a way that we can learn about a topic. And then the third way, being very honest, drugs come out, new drugs come out all the time. And very often we learn about them from the pharmaceutical company sending some sales reps, or a commercial we see on TV, or maybe there's an article about it in a medical journal. Now think about psychedelic science. It's going to be a while before it makes it to the medical school curriculum. And so we have to look at those other options. And so we're very lucky to have some companies that are starting to make continuing education courses on psychedelics that clinicians can take for credit. So that's going to be very helpful. That's one way we definitely can get this education to the primary care providers. And another way is that it's going to be some time before somebody like USONA has representatives that can go out to doctors. But that is another way that will happen. So that's part of what the Psychedelic Medicine Association is doing, is that part of what we hope to provide is monthly scientific research summations so that doctors can keep abreast of it. Because even if you're doing a continuing medical education course, you may take that once a year or once every 2 years. But as you all know, psychedelic science is ramping up much more quickly than that. So we plan to send every month just what's the latest in psychedelic science and catch physicians and clinicians up on what's been going on. So number one challenge, lack of education. And by the way, this is where I had to throw in this little reminder, is please do not fault your providers for not knowing these things. It is very hard to know what you don't know that you don't know. And most doctors are very overworked and per our healthcare system have very little time to spend with patients. And hopefully as psychedelic science becomes more readily available, the whole system gets to evolve a little bit. But in the current system, your physician is probably doing the best they can, and they may not be trying to be closed-minded if they don't know about it. It's just something that your average doctor, if they're not exposed to this, just doesn't know about. So just take the time, if you can, to help turn them on to it and say, well, here, check out the Psychedelic Medicine Association if you'd like to learn more. There are other doctors out here. This is not a fringe thing. This is happening. So challenge number two is stigma. Most practitioners who are practicing today, either them or their parents were around for the initial psychedelic wave, and there was a lot of stigma that came with that. Oh, this is just for dropping out of society, etc. Well, I'm not dissing dropping out of society, but it's also very good for a number of other things, as we've been learning. And so it's part of what we have to overcome, is that there's that baseline stigma, and so that education piece will help a lot with that stigma, but it is still very real, and so it's one of the hurdles we have to address in getting these medicines out. Now, the third challenge here on the clinician side is, and this is, I'm speaking for the doctors and the primary care providers in the United States here, but there's a lot of fear of litigation. We have a very litigious society, malpractice suits all over the place. And so it has the effect of requiring doctors to practice more conservatively than they may want to because of this fear. So fear of litigation comes up in that if we have a subject brought to us that we don't know much about, it's going to be very hard for us to feel comfortable discussing that subject. And so that's a perfect example is psychedelics, because if somebody comes to you and says, can I use psilocybin for my depression, and you have no idea what psilocybin is about, it's going to be really hard to say, oh yeah, I feel totally confident saying yes, go to this practitioner. So that's one area where fear of litigation is an issue, and again, that one can be addressed by education. But then there's a second level, which is the fear of doctors about being cited for malpractice for talking about things that are not legal. So currently there are psychedelic options, as we know, in other countries, places that they are legal, but imagine an American doctor feeling safe talking about anything that resembles a recommendation that a patient go there when it's an illegal substance in the US. So that is another challenge that we have before us. So some solutions here, and by the way, these are all solutions in process. These are just questions that I like to bring up. By the way, I see my camera's just like kind of waving itself all over the place. Sorry about that. Hope you're not getting seasick. Maybe there's an earthquake here in Austin. But number one is we have to do the education that I was talking about earlier, and not to the point where we need doctors to become psychedelic specialists. Like, we're not expecting primary care doctors to stop practicing primary care and suddenly become a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the same level of knowledge that your average family medicine or internal medicine doctor has. Like, I was a family medicine trained doctor, and we were trained to know just a little bit about every area, but then if it goes past that little bit that we needed to know, we refer to specialists. And so I foresee that being the model that we will have when psychedelic medicine is more prevalent. I'm not going to be sitting with somebody for, well, first off, I don't see patients anymore, but my colleagues aren't necessarily going to be sitting with somebody in an MDMA therapy session for 8 hours. They're probably going to be referring out to that. So we just need to get to the level that primary care providers have, the education on psychedelics that they have on the other fields here. And another step is educating these primary care providers on the legalities, like how to legally and safely speak with patients about these medicines, some of which may be illegal. And also, when you're still not all the way ramped up to that level of knowledge, how do you have those conversations and keep yourself legally safe? Now, taking a look at the challenges on the patient side, the first one is that legally safe access. And this is where I'm going to have more questions than answers, and I'm just bringing these up for people to start to think about. But we've seen a number of models out there. There's efforts to decriminalize them. There's efforts to do legal medicalization. There's efforts to get FDA approval. But at the end of the day, getting these in some way where the patients are not going to suffer legally for using them is obviously key. But another issue, as I mentioned before in our scenarios, is that these aren't covered by health insurance. They're still going to be inaccessible to the majority of patients. And we do not want this to become another bastion of the wealthy and privileged only. So many people need these medicines, and many of them are underserved, underprivileged, and have suffered a lot of trauma at the hands of the system that could then therefore continue to keep these medicines from them. So we need this to be much more accessible and therefore covered under some type of health insurance. So is it we talk to the current health insurances or we start our own? That is an area that needs to be addressed. And finally, there has to be no retribution from whomever is paying for these health insurance. So if it's a vet who gets VA insurance, or it's somebody on Medicaid or Medicare, there can't be retribution for using these psychedelic medicines. All of those are going to prevent, if there's anything in that area that isn't addressed, it's going to prevent physicians from being able to have this conversation with their patients, where the patient feels completely comfortable sharing their psychedelic use, and the physician feels comfortable sharing what they know about psychedelics, so the two can work together on a plan. So if you would like to join us in working towards solutions to these challenges, I invite you to come over to the Psychedelic Medicine Association. We have individual practitioners as members, and then other key stakeholders in the industry that are working on these different pieces, and we all join together in this forum where we can discuss ideas and work towards these solutions together. So I wanted to thank PsyTech for inviting me to come and speak to you all, and if you're interested, please head over to psychedelicmedicineassociation.org to learn more. Thanks so much.